Hey everyone, this is Andy Dowling from the Australian metal band LORD and host of the Andy Social Podcast. This is my nod to the old school. This podcast series is all about the old school mixtape and compilation, where I get to talk to some of the best in the business about their first introductions to heavy music and what were on those early mixtapes. My Nod to the Old School is brought to you by LORD's brand new album, Fallen Idols, available right now through Dominus Records and lord.net.au. For us, Fallen Idols was inspired by that old school mixtape, and whether you love thrash metal, power metal, melodic death, black and thrash, or even a bit of AOR, Fallen Idols is the ultimate metal mixtape that throws back to the nostalgic past of when we all discovered heavy music for the first time, but accompanied by a fresh, modern, world-class production. Here's a quick clip from track 9 of Fallen Idols called Kill or Be Killed.
The sun is drawing low. The dark and cold are waiting for you. If fear is all you know, it's time to turn and learn what you truly need to do. And you're standing here alone now. No safety, no sanity. It's time to make your own life. Take control when you learn that it's kill or be killed. Kill or be killed. Kill or be killed. Kill or be killed.
And here we go. Episode 9 of My Nod to the Old School is with Joel Green. Now, if you're not familiar with Joel, he is the drummer in Canberra metal band Witchskull, but he's also a bit of a metal legend here in Australia. He was in Armoured between the mid-80s up until the mid-90s, who were a legendary death and thrash metal band. Make sure you go and check them out. And he was also the man behind the Metal for the Brain Festival that kicked off in 1991. And it was a yearly festival where people from all over the country congregated together to see some of the best metal bands that Australia's ever put together. Joel has been such a contributor to Australian metal, it's really understated, and I don't think he gets enough praise for what he has done over the years. These days with Witchskull, he's still touring around the place and putting out some incredible music. And in this chat, we touch on a lot of those early days where he has a compilation or mixtape that he put together for all ages shows back in the early 90s that was filled with all sorts of great extreme metal that he still plays in his shed today. So it's really, really cool that he's able to hold on to these artifacts from yesteryear and continue to get enjoyment out of them. Lots of great stories in this chat, and if you want to reach out to Joel, you can do so via the show notes over at lord.net.au. Witchskull, you can go and check out their music by going to witchskull.bandcamp.com. And of course, if you don't want to go to Lord, you can go to andydowling.net as well. I'll have the show notes over there also. But here we go. This is episode 9 with Joel Green.
Yeah, look, I did. I personally sort of listened to, I suppose when I was really young, we sort of kind of still did that sort of thing of taking things off the radio. But I got sort of pretty into heavy music early on, so I was kind of buying, I think I bought my first Deep Purple album when I was 11 or something, so. And I was really into Kiss and that sort of stuff, so it was less taken off the radio for us and more about just sort of playing vinyl and whatnot. But look, I suppose for a mixtape for me, there's one that I actually still play to this day. I'm always blasting in my shed, which is an old metal compilation my brother put together back in the 80s, and we used to sort of play it when we did the Armoured Angel. Used to play the youth cafe shows back in the day. We used to sort of play this through the PA sort of before bands started, in between bands and whatever. So for me, it's just kind of a real snapshot of that era of the in the 80s. So yeah, I still listen to it, and all of those songs I still really dig. So it's just, I suppose, it's not my mixtape; it was my brother's, but I've sort of had it ever since it was sort of made, and then still playing it today on the same cassette.
What sort of songs were on it?
Look, there was all the stuff that kind of obviously my brother and I were sort of getting into that sort of stuff at the same time. So there's stuff like, the early Exodus stuff, early Destruction, Venom, Frost, Sodom, Slayer, all that sort of stuff. All the things that we were really heavily into Mortal Sin at the time. When Mortal Sin first sort of broke, we were going up to Sydney to watch them in 1987 when they had the original lineup that played on Mayhemic Destruction. Bands like Exhumer, Dark Angel, sort of Hallows Eve, all these kind of cool old sort of bands. There was a kind of mixture of stuff because it still had Motorhead tracks on it. So it was that whole era when, that the first wave of thrash was well and truly in and established. But for us, as the newer thrash stuff sort of started taking hold, we were sort of still sort of more geared up to the earlier thrash, you know what I mean? By the time Exodus' second album came out, I wasn't so into them, you know what I mean? But their first album I still rate as one of the best records ever made. So, that's the same as the early Destruction stuff and early Creator, and that sort of, so that was kind of where we were at.
I mean, you guys obviously had a fair bit of knowledge about, the genre of metal and had your bands and your types of, I guess, genre of metal that you guys were into. How did your brother put it together? Was it a case of just dubbing them sort of off vinyl and trying to do this really?
It would have been off all of his personal records. Like, I was an absolute Motorhead fanatic from about the age of 13. So growing up with my brother was good because all I did was the only money I spent was on Motorhead records. So I've just got this huge Motorhead collection because it's all I bought. And I got influenced in all of the other stuff just through listening to his records. And he worked at Impact Records, and Lucy, the bass player, ended up working there as well. So they were in charge of just stocking the whole section of the whole sort of heavy metal section within Impact. They were responsible for stocking that. So they had a lot to do with the way the Canberra scene kind of grew because it was so DIY here in Canberra. Pubs wouldn't let you play, so we had to set up our own shows at youth centres. So these mixtapes were also, I believe, sort of, influenced and exposed the real young kids that were coming to the gigs of the sort of, the stuff that we really liked. And I think that's why Canberra always had we always punched above our weight a little bit for the size of our town, just because everything was so DIY, you really had to work your ass off. And because all of our shows were all ages, because you couldn't play in pubs, it meant that all of these young kids got a chance to experience metal from a really young age, because, again, this is pre, any sort of these bands ever coming to Australia. So it was just one of those things where it just kind of... so that's what I think I like this mixtape so much. Still, I love all the songs, but it just reminds me of that era when this sort of stuff was... Although it had been out several years, it was the stuff that we were really pushing in our sort of local community.
It definitely would have been an advantage having your brother work at a music store. So, obviously there's having the ability to be able to source music and have access to different labels and be able to, order things in and have sort of that access to lots of different stuff is a huge advantage. But also for you guys to sort of have the initiative collectively to go, well, if there's no opportunities for us, let's try and make those opportunities ourselves and put on our own shows and obviously, play this and share this music to the local area. And I mean, obviously, history, shows what's come of that, but definitely some great opportunities that you both had as far as being able to have access to that music.
Yeah, look, I think Canberra was one of those weird places where we just didn't know any better. It was like, before I was in Armoured Angel, I was in a band called Under Oath, which was kind of like, I suppose we were starting to lean towards sort of speed metal or thrash metal in 86, and we used to support Armoured Angel. So, and the guy that I was in that band with, Marcus, is the guy I'm now in with Witchskull. So Marcus and I have been playing in bands sort of forever. But, one of the early shows in Canberra was something called the Heavy Metal Holocaust in 1986 that my band and Mark's band Under Oath supported, Armoured Angel on that. And that was just like a local gig where it was the only way you could do shows. So it was a huge big show that was put on, I think 600 or 700 people turned up to it. It was an amazing thing to sort of, for me as a young kid, only being 16, I was going, oh, right, so this is what you do. When you play a gig, you actually book the venue, you build the drum riser. So I just learned from a very early age that anything you do it's all DIY. And I think that's how the Metal for the Brain stuff started, because that's all I knew. All I knew was when you do your own shows, like when we did the Youth Cafe shows, it was the same thing. We had to bring our own drum risers and build them and then set up the stage. We had to clean the joint after everyone had left, and you know what I mean? We used to bring huge, big PAs in a massive light show, so we tried to sort of make it as big an event as possible. Of course, we just thought these shows were tiny little, obscure shows compared to the rest of the world, but you see other footage now and you realise a lot of the bands kicking around at the same time. We were rivaling them with the production and the effort that we were putting in, you know what I mean? So it was just kind of one of those things of, I suppose I'm still doing it to this day. We just learned that from Canberra you had to be DIY because no one was ever really going to put much on. Now, it's different now with venues like the Basement and Transit Bar and whatnot, but yeah, back in our day we just didn't have that sort of option.
Well, I mean, the advantage of sort of having to go through that, and having no choice and no knowledge as well, you sort of just, this is what you do, you just got to make it happen, is that you can appreciate when you do walk into a venue where you don't have to set it up yourself. But also, I think, some of the guys, in more recent years that have come into playing music probably don't have, not in all cases, but I think in some cases probably don't have the same sort of, not appreciation, but probably not thinking what the possibilities are with them putting their own effort into it. I think we sort of rely on whatever's existing around us and go, well, that's all we've got to work with. But, what you've just said is a great example of, if you just, put your effort into it, then anything's possible.
Well, I think I think some of the young bands could learn a bit from that. I still believe doing poster runs and just really pushing, as opposed to just a Facebook event goes up and then you sit back and expect people to come. So I still think there's ways where the old school operated where you can sort of lure more people by making a bit more of an event. Like I've tried some things with Witchskull now to do sort of mixed sort of genre things, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But I think I've done some in Canberra where we had bands like I Exist and Hellbringer on the same bill of Witchskull, you know what I mean, which is a kind of pretty diverse kind of mix, but it worked, you know what I mean? So this is going back a few years we did that, but things like that you don't sort of see as often. And I don't know, we used to play lots. When I was playing in Armoured Angel back in the day, we'd be playing with hardcore bands and all kinds of different stuff, and people didn't seem to care. It was just whatever, you know what I mean? It was just different bills of all extreme music with different variants of it. And I don't know, there's something that's kind of been lost a little bit like that for me. It just seems to be every sort of, genre now all has to be the same in order to put bills together. And it's good sometimes, but I think other times it's also good to mix it up a bit,
Well, it's a great way for people to discover a new band, if they're sort of just within their little niche group of people that listen to the same style or same subgenre of metal or whatever it might be, then you're only going to get exposed to a limited amount of music. And if you suddenly rock up to a gig where one of your favorite bands is playing, but suddenly there's a band that you would never normally pay to go and see, there's a possibility that person might end up enjoying what they're watching.
Well, look, that's what I found with that show that I originally sort of put together. It just kind of sort of clicked, and there was people saying to me, "Oh, I've been wanting to see Hellbringer for years, but I've never got round to it," or whatever, you know what I mean? So it just sort of forced people to see something that they may have heard of but never actually. And people were sort of blown away with how good and how well the sort of show went. So, look, I don't know. I suppose I've sort of been in the game, in the scene, I suppose, for long enough to have seen sort of enough things to know that you can try different things, and sometimes they can sort of come off, But I suppose the main thing is I just think since social media's come along, I think people tend to think that that's all you need to do in order to create interest for a show. And I just think that's one aspect of it. I really do. Every show we play, we still actually print A3 flyers and spend money on getting a proper flyer sort of designed and all of these sorts of things. And I just still think there's ways of kind of trying to just create a bit more of an interesting or unique sort of event to try and get more people sort of through the door. But it's not easy, you know what I mean? As the years are going on, it's harder to get people at at local shows. Still seem to be able to be fine pulling heads to the international stuff, but, for whatever reasons, Australia still seems to struggle a bit with people really latching on to the local talent that we've got here, you know?
Well, I think one thing that we've lost, and hopefully we'll get back at some stage in the future, is being able to have the ease of being able to put together, all ages lineups and being able to expose music to people that are under the age of 18, because as you said, years and years ago when you guys are putting on shows, you were doing it because you had no choice and this was the only option you had, but doing these sort of youth center style shows where these kids are getting exposed to music really early when they're impressionable and they're discovering stuff for the first time and they're really sort of enjoying sort of all these different social settings, but also music and entertainment and all this kind of stuff. And so that's where you really breed some great loyalty and people become obsessed with music. I mean, that's such a defining moment of people's lives. And I think we've lost a lot of that over the last 10 or 15 years because, all licensing and costs of putting on these shows and the risks that are involved as far as liabilities are concerned, it's really, really difficult. So you've missed out on sections of the last generation, I should say, where these kids have come up and sort of not had that exposure of these great all ages shows. And that's why sort of other genres like hardcore and those hardcore and punk scenes did relatively well sort of a decade ago, because they were really sort of big into the youth center scene and got a lot of these kids over the line. So when they turned 18, here they were rocking up on the doorstep for these bigger shows. But it's something that we can work on.
Well, look, I think you're right, and I think that's what I was saying about Canberra. Always seemed to have a really strong scene, and I think that came from the fact that, there was always the youth cafe shows. So from when kids were basically 12, 13 years old, they were coming from the youth cafe shows, and that fed right into the Metal for the Brains that were always all ages as well. So for people in Canberra, they just sort of grew up with bands like us and Alchemist and many others, where these sort of shows happen, regular enough. And because Alchemist and us would bring people through Melbourne or from Sydney bands and whatever down, people in Canberra were being exposed to this stuff, and they were generally, there were still over 18 shows that we did at certain places. On the whole, if you were young, you at least had Metal for the Brain every single year that you could go and sort of catch with all the best stuff that was happening with the Oz bands, So you're right, it's probably missed a little bit. It probably wouldn't be a bad idea to start looking into maybe bringing some of that sort of stuff back. But you're right, it's definitely difficult. They've made it harder with public liability and all that sort of stuff. Everything seems to be so... everything's so precious these days, you know what I mean? At the end of the day, I think everyone sort of misses out a bit because we're just, just over cautious with everything.
Yeah, definitely. It's an ongoing challenge, and hopefully there'll be some new opportunities down the track. But I think the more that people sort of talk about that and think about it, I think probably the likelihood of things changing are going to increase. So it's something that I always think about, but I probably should make a bit more of an effort to talk about it, because I think there's a lot of missed opportunities there. I think there's a lot of young guys that are sort of looking for great music and great ways to express themselves and a bit of an outlet. And the internet's fantastic because a lot of these guys are discovering music, but it's generally music from the other side of the world, and that's why your international shows are going really well. And obviously from a nostalgic point of view, a lot of the older guys, I mean, they can't get out every weekend, so they're going to dedicate their money and their time to those bigger shows where there's a bit more of a nostalgic trip. So you've got to try and grab that next wave of young people. But it's definitely something to think about for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Going back to this mixtape, so apart from playing it on the PA at these shows back in the day, was this tape ever? I mean, you mentioned before that you still got it now. Was it played anywhere else? Was it played at parties? Was it played at home? Or was it used anywhere else, or was it sort of primarily used for the PA?
Well, yeah, because obviously back in those days, that's where everyone had cassette decks in the cars and whatnot. So this is the sort of stuff that we'd sort of hoon around Canberra Street, sort of blasting sort of old school metal. And this is probably, around this would be the late 80s, so a lot of the stuff that's on it is kind of the real, much earlier on in the 80s, sort of 82 to 85 probably. So that was the era that I sort of, or 81 really, if you're talking extreme stuff, starting with, Venom and then moving through to the, early sort of, very early Metallica, early Slayer, all of that sort of stuff, Creator, Sodom, all of that sort of cool stuff was always our sort of thing. So, we were listening to this stuff even though there was the later wave of thrash came through that I never really liked. By sort of 1987, I couldn't really stomach a lot of the stuff that was coming out in that scene, whereas that early stuff was really good. So, yeah, we played it in the car, sort of take it to parties. I was always kind of, had sort of big boom boxes and, it's always kind of inflicting my sort of personal tastes onto everybody around me. So some people liked it and some didn't. But, yeah, it's just one of these, this particular one is just one of these sort of weird things that seems to have travelled with me my whole life. And I literally play it really regularly just in my shed. I've got an old beat-up tape player that, we used to record all the old Armoured Angel rehearsals on. So I've still got that set up and I just sort of spin this tape all the time. And there's been bits and pieces that have been taped over it on the years, you know what I mean? Some old Armoured stuff. So there's still some other stuff that over the years has been kind of, taped over and whatnot, but it just seems to be this survivor from my past and just always brings back sort of those early memories of the youth cafe shows when I was sort of 17,
I think it's amazing, and it must be one quality brand cassette to last the test of times over so many years, because we all know sort of cassettes have got a bit of a shelf life, especially if you're playing them to death, and it sounds like it's definitely had a great run so far and still giving you some value.
Well, I'm guessing some of the productions on the albums that were recorded on it, you probably don't notice it as much, but it's a TDK EP9. Well, my brother was pretty pedantic. Every record he bought was only played once and recorded onto really good quality cassettes, and then the record was filed away, never to be sort of touched again, you know what I mean? So we grew up just cassettes for everything. Everything was just, once it was purchased, it was recorded. Like all my Motorhead records were the same. Once they were on tapes, they were all filed away, and then the tapes were just kind of, because, that was the thing that was, as kids we were able to get around with boom boxes and later on in cars, so they just all had cassette decks. So it's funny, when I hear things now sometimes on cassette, it sounds more like what I think it's supposed to sound like, because you've got all that hiss and white noise underneath before it starts. And later on with CDs, you're missing that hiss. So when I put on a cassette, it sort of, to me, feels like, that's how it's supposed to sound.
that hiss of comfort.
That's it.
I love it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's it just reminds me of, even for me, being really pedantic about taking care of things that I've purchased, especially when you're younger, where everything's so expensive and you can only buy one thing at a time, and you slowly build up a collection, especially when it comes to music. And everything's just, you handle it with great care. And just to even have that sort of thought that, your brother's approach of playing it once to dub it onto a cassette, and then the vinyl's packed away or neatly put on the shelf or whatever it is, away from potentially getting harmed or damaged, and that cassette is what gets played. And I love that, because it feeds into my own tendencies as far as the way I look after things, which is quite pedantic, but it makes a hell of a lot of sense.
Oh, look, I'm the same, you know what I mean? Even when I was buying Motorhead stuff, I'd have the Japanese press CDs that remained sealed, and then I'd buy the cheaper version that I could actually play. I look back now and you just kind of shake my head at how sort of full on I was. But never as bad as my brother. His records were just absolutely mint beyond mint, you know what I mean? They was just literally one play and that was it. He's still got some pretty old rare stuff that's just in absolutely as mint as you can get condition. But yeah, look, it's one of those things, isn't it? As times change, people got shot of a lot of vinyl. Now vinyl's come back in, and I got shot of a lot of vinyl when, not the Motorhead stuff, but when CDs came in, I moved into that, and now I'm ending up buying back a heap of the vinyl that I used to have. You know what I mean? I've still got on CD because I want to hear it on vinyl again. So yeah, it's funny how that sort of thing, tends to sort of go in cycles.
That's right. Yeah, definitely come in full circle. Joel, thank you so much. It's great to hear these stories, and even for me growing up, and I'm a bit younger than you, but I just trying to discover music and work out what's great and what's not, and just trying to like awkwardly put together cassettes and little compilations of things that you love. And a big thing with our album is that it's a bit of a throwback to times where we would just put together music that we loved, and a lot of it's sort of metal or even hard rock, and just anything with sort of heavy and loud guitars, and it was just that sort of nostalgic sort of period where you sort of didn't have direct access to every little bit of music at your fingertips like you do now, and you sort of had to really go on a hunt to try and discover music. And as you said earlier, like by the time you guys got onto particular bands and music, I mean, some of that stuff had already been out for a couple of years as well. So there was a bit of a delay back then as well. So it's
look, it was amazing. We used to actually you buy an album based on a band you liked. You saw them in a fanzine wearing a T-shirt.
Yeah.
You go, oh, what's that band he's wearing? I like that band. That album must be good. We'll buy it. And then so you'd order this thing from overseas and wait weeks on this record, and that's how we found stuff. So I kind of like that. Like, I get technology, we've moved on from that, but the fact you can now just YouTube anything you want at any second, you know what I mean? You miss that sort of nostalgia of, when I was collecting Motorhead records, I knew that the No Class single was released with all three, there's three covers, each with one of their faces on it. So I knew that, but I'd never had any of them. It took me like about 12 years to finally get all three of them. And when I opened it up to see that picture for the first time, because you couldn't go onto the internet and just, bring up the image, just the buzz you would get out of those sorts of things is something that you don't seem to get as much now. So, yeah, I sort of get a bit nostalgic with all that sort of stuff too. And, I suppose that's anything as time goes on. There's a lot of people that still refuse to move into, probably refuse to listen to CDs because they thought that was like an abomination compared to vinyl. So it's just interesting.
It is, definitely. Well, Joel, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and we'll definitely have to catch up if you're around when we play in Canberra. Well, it'd be great to say hi. Otherwise, I'll probably come and see you guys at Steel Assassins anyway.
Oh, look, excellent. It'd be really good to actually meet up and have a beer. So, yeah, look, appreciate the time you've taken to contact me, and that was excellent. I really appreciate it.
To learn more about our guest, check out the show notes over at andydowling.net as well as lord.net.au, where you can hear our brand new album, Fallen Idols. Cheers for listening, and this has been my nod to the old school. Larry, please.